Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I am your host, Rex Bear, and we have Tony Ortega with us from TonyOrtega.org, the underground bunker. And we are going to dive deep into Scientology today. He's been doing research for years on this. He is the go-to source. He's been featured on HBO, Discovery Channel. I spoke with him a couple years ago, and just a plethora of intel. It's a real honor to speak with you, Tony, here at the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
Hey, thanks for having me on. Things are great.
Fantastic. Well, a lot of our listeners have actually requested I get you on the show, and I'm a huge fan of science fiction. I absolutely love it, and it certainly seems like science fiction has kind of taken over certain religious aspects now. I have a very close friend that's into Scientology, and it seems like she even knows what it's about, but she's trying to get involved, and it's very interesting. So if you would, for our audience, please tell them a little bit about yourself, and then let's jump into the meat and potatoes.
Sure. Well, I'm a journalist. I worked for various newspapers over the years, and starting back in 1995, I just developed a sort of interest and specialty in Scientology. I covered a lot of other subjects over the years, but I would always come back to Scientology. I'd developed some really good sources in it, and the reason why I've continued to cover it is it's just a fascinating, changing story. Scientology's only been around for 60 years, but the last few have really been a really crucial time. It's going through a very difficult time. It's splitting apart. It's changing, and for those reasons, I've stayed interested. And I decided a couple years back to actually write a book about one aspect of it, and created a website to support that book and to cover Scientology as a daily beat. So that's what I've been doing. And yeah, as you mentioned, it's gotten me on several programs. I was on Alex Gibney's documentary Going Clear that was on HBO last year. And, it's just been fascinating to watch how this stuff changes. As far as what Scientology is all about, it's interesting to hear you say that you've got a friend that's getting into it. Oftentimes, I have people that were in Scientology for many years come to my website and tell me they only really learned about what Scientology is all about once they left. That, Scientology is one of these things that when you get into it, they only want you to learn a little bit at a time. And what those of us who study the whole project get to know is material that people don't discover inside until they've been in it for years and years. And sometimes they never discover it until they come out and they read my website, talk to the people at my website. And so that's one of the reasons why, one of the many reasons why Scientology is such a fascinating subject is that it's secretive even to its own people. And, many of the beginners never find out anything about what's in the operating Thetan levels, what entities like the Religious Technology Center and the Church of Spiritual Technology are doing, and why Scientology has underground vaults in parts of the country, and so many fascinating, strange, and like you said, sort of related to science fiction elements in Scientology that I really enjoy studying. But like I said, Scientologists themselves often don't know about until they leave.
Now, that kind of reminds me of certain mystery schools. Once you get initiated to a different level, then they give you more information, etc. And
Right.
if I obviously know it was Hubbard that founded the Church of Scientology. I know a little bit about his background, hanging out with people like Parsons and Crowley. And I mean, he was a brilliant man, very, very intelligent. So didn't he used to talk about ways to make money would be start a religion, though? I mean, wasn't that something he used to brag about before he did it?
This is one of those things that comes up all the time, and I actually dug into it because there's a few different sort of stories going around about L. Ron Hubbard and how he started all this. Hubbard really led a very remarkable life. He was born in Nebraska, but he grew up in the Pacific Northwest. His dad was in the Navy, so he ended up in places like, China and the Philippines when he was just a kid. He really saw a lot of the world and was fascinated by it. He was a glider pilot when he was only in his 20s. He tried multiple times to get into the military and finally got into the Navy as a lieutenant during World War II. And, he developed the skills of a tall tale teller, which served him well because in the 30s and the 40s, he became a very successful pulp fiction writer. He wrote, stories about Westerns and adventures and romances. And science fiction was just one of the things he got known for. It's the thing he was probably most well known for was science fiction. And, he was just a really prolific writer, wrote all kinds of short stories for magazines back in the day. But it was, it was hard work and it didn't pay well. He was making about a penny a word. And so he went to war, came back. He did not have a very distinguished war record. He actually had some embarrassing incidents. And he was looking for a new direction in his life. And he started working on this project around 1948. And around that time, in 1948 and 49, he started telling people, he told multiple people this in multiple times, that, writing at a penny a word just isn't going to get you anywhere. And if you really wanted to make a fortune, you need to start a religion. And we know that he said this because we have eyewitnesses. The FDA investigated him and found those eyewitnesses. It's all documented. Scientology tries to pretend it never happened, but there's no question. In 48 and 49, L. Ron Hubbard told multiple people that the way to get rich was to start a religion. Now, there's another story about the start of Scientology that I remember hearing 20 years ago, and that was that Hubbard and his he had very good friends in the science fiction community. One of whom was Robert Heinlein, who was probably his best friend in science fiction. And there's a story that the two of them made a bet to see who could start the most profitable religion. I think that's an apocryphal story, especially since I've actually read the letters between Hubbard and Heinlein in this period, and there's nothing like that in them. So I don't think that story's true, but it's definitely true that Hubbard was telling people that, if you want to make a lot of money, you need to start a religion. He then came out with a book in 1950 that wasn't religious at all. It's called Dianetics, and the subtitle is The Modern Science of Mental Health. And it's very important to keep that in mind. He advertised this from the beginning as a new science. He believed that he was the first person to discover how the human mind actually worked, that it had two halves. One half was this perfectly recording analytical mind that is this perfect computer. But when you were knocked unconscious and you went through traumatic incidents, this other half of your mind took over. It's called the reactive mind. And he theorized that this was a result of evolution, and that when you were going through really awful experiences, this other part of the mind took over to spare you the worst of it. But it recorded those incidents, and then those incidents would come back up when you were re-stimulated. And he theorized that everything that was holding you back in your adult life was the result of these awful memories you went through as a very young child, and they're literally stored in your cells. He abandoned that theory pretty quickly, but that was the original idea. And the most powerful of those theories, of those traumatic memories, which he called engrams, occurred when you were in the womb. That when you were a fetus or even a sperm cell or an egg cell, things that happened to you were stored in your cells, and as an adult, something would trigger it, and you'd have this memory. And so when Dianetics first came out, he had these clubs sprout out all around the country where people wanted to try to remember what awful things they had gone through when they were fetuses inside their mother. And I got to tell you, there's absolutely no science to this. It's completely ludicrous. You do not have memories of being a fetus stored in your cells. But it was popular for about a year, and he made a lot of money, and it changed his life. And then it just completely died out. His foundations he founded went bankrupt. He had to start all over again. And by that time, a lot of the people that liked this idea of going back in time to find out what's wrong with you today felt that going back to the womb wasn't far enough. They wanted to go back even farther to previous lives. And Hubbard was a little skeptical about this at first, but then he realized, if you can charge people to try to remember what happened in one lifetime, imagine what you can charge them to remember hundreds or thousands or millions of lifetimes. So he then regrouped in 1952 in Phoenix, Arizona, and came out with this new thing that he called Scientology. And part of the reason why he did that was in the awful year of 1951, when everything had fallen apart, he'd actually lost the use of the word Dianetics in bankruptcy court. So he had to come up with a new name anyway. So in 1952, he came up with the name Scientology. Eventually, he got the name Dianetics back, and he tried to make them work together. And I could show you, the details where they don't really work together. There's problems, very strange things where he tries to make them work together. But to this day, you start out doing Dianetics and then kind of graduate to Scientology. And the idea behind it is that, you're supposed to remember with Scientology counseling lifetimes that you've had thousands, millions, billions of years ago on other planets, and that some incident that happened to you 10 billion years ago in some other galaxy is the reason today why you have an ulcer, or why you're uncomfortable speaking in front of a crowd, or you're not better at your job. And so that's what Scientologists are paying for. Now, they don't know that. See, again, we come back to this idea of keeping secrets. When you first join Scientology, you don't know any of this. They don't tell you this at all. All they tell you, they're going to help you with your communications. They don't tell you that it's going to get gradually more and more and more expensive until at some point you're spending hundreds of dollars an hour to try to recover those memories from millions of years ago. That's what Scientology really is. They just don't like to talk about it. And it's been incredibly profitable for them. They, at one point in about the year 1990, they got up to about 100,000 members. And they were taking in incredible money, particularly at their headquarters in Florida. But it's been shrinking ever since then, and they're struggling to bring in new people.
I was watching a film the other day that had Tom Cruise in it, and I was thinking to myself, I wonder how much influence Scientology has over some of these films. I was actually told by somebody the other day that there's three big factions in Hollywood now. You've got a big faction of witches and warlocks and Satanists, literally people that worship Satan. And then there's a faction that's of Scientologists and a faction of gay and lesbian people. That are three big factions controlling Hollywood. So is there still a lot of influence in Hollywood as well with Scientology, or is that something that's also kind of withered away?
No, Scientology just doesn't have the influence that it used to have. I think at one point, it was hard to blame a young person coming to Hollywood and saying, well, I better join Scientology if I want to get, ahead in Hollywood. I think at one time that may have made sense for a few people, but today, no. Today, Scientology is a laughingstock. Virtually every TV series and a lot of the new movies coming out all have to have a joke about Scientology in them now because it's just become such a laughingstock. And no, look, what runs Scientology is money. I'm sorry. Well, that's true. But what runs Hollywood? What runs Hollywood is money.
Right.
Is what shows are going to make money. And right now, what's got the upper hand is superhero stuff. It's just it's really hard to get a movie made now that's not about superheroes, and that's not about Satanism or Scientology. It's just Hollywood is a feudal system that's worked the same way for 100 years. It's very resistant to change. And there's no, it's right now the flavor of the month is Men in Tights.
Men in Tights, you got that right. I'll tell you though, I certainly enjoy watching some of these Marvel films that come out. I mean, with the special effects that they use and the storylines. But you're right, Hollywood has used a certain blueprint for films and TV shows and entertainment for over 100 years. There's an underlying theme in all of it. Now, with the Scientology and the different levels and stuff, I know Tom Cruise is an ambassador somewhat for Scientology. Is he still heavily involved with that group? And could you talk to us about some of these different levels, et cetera?
Sure. Yeah, Tom is definitely very involved. And there's actually a story to that. I'll go into a little bit about Tom's involvement. They were pretty good in the 70s and 80s at bringing celebrities in. L. Ron Hubbard had actually first proposed that in 1955. He announced Project Celebrity, and he wanted people to try to bring celebrities into Scientology because he knew he didn't want people to pry into what Scientology really was. But if you put some famous person out there saying, "Hey, come on in, it's great," then that normalizes things. It makes it look, well, if Tom Cruise is doing it, there's got to be something to it. So they tried very hard to bring celebrities in, and they had some limited success. But then in the 70s, they did a pretty good job. They got in John Travolta, they got in Kirstie Alley. 1986, they got in Tom Cruise. And some celebrities get in for a short time and leave. Seinfeld was only in for a short time, but some of these people really get convinced that. John Travolta in particular is really convinced that all of his success comes from L. Ron Hubbard, and you just can't convince him otherwise. And Tom Cruise is largely the same. Tom was brought in because he was starting to date a woman named Mimi Rogers, who was a Scientologist. They got married on May 9th, 1987, which is Dianetics Day. It's the same day that Dianetics was published in 1950. But then by 1990, David Miscavige, the guy who had taken over Scientology, he was thrilled to have a star like Tom Cruise in Scientology. But Mimi was a problem because her father had once owned a Scientology franchise, but then he had left the church and was practicing Scientology outside the church, which is really bad as far as the leader of Scientology goes. And so he didn't really want his hot new star attached to this woman who was attached to what they call a squirrel, somebody who's left and still doing it. So Miscavige helped engineer the breakup of Tom Cruise and Mimi Rogers by encouraging Tom to have an affair with Nicole Kidman, who was on the set with him in the 1990 movie Days of Thunder. I wrote a complete story about this whole thing. That I was really the first to explain how this all worked with the help of former Scientology officials like Marty Rathman, who were there at the time. So anyway, they used Nicole to break up Tom with Mimi, and then Tom really fell head over heels for Nicole and married her, which Miscavige wasn't really planning on. He wasn't thrilled because Nicole has her own problems. But at first, Nicole was very much, she's like, yeah, hey, if Scientology is part of the package, I'll do it. And so she became a very enthusiastic joiner of Scientology once they got together in 1990. And she went, but in the next year and a half, she went all the way to OT2, which is just really fast. She must have really dedicated herself to Scientology in the first couple of years she was with Tom. But then by that time, something soured her on it. And she decided to stop doing Scientology, and I think she probably didn't like David Miscavige. And so what happened in 1992, and none of us knew this until years later, she pulled Tom out with her. And Tom was basically out of Scientology from 1992 all the way until when they broke up at the end of 2000. And they kept this very quiet. The Scientology was very successful in making sure the rest of the world didn't know this. We all assumed Tom was still a Scientologist, but he really wasn't. He was away from the church. He came back and did a few things. In 1998, he took, he did an exercise, that kind of thing. But basically, Nicole and Tom were away until 2000 when they broke up. And then Miscavige made it job one, get Tom back in. And so from 2001 to 2004, Marty Rathman's top main job was to just work on Tom Cruise, audit him, get him revved up. And boy, it worked. By 2004, Tom Cruise was now the most enthusiastic Scientologist on the planet. And Miscavige wanted to, reward him for it. And so in October 2004 is when they have October is when they have their annual gala for the International Association of Scientologists, IAS. And they hand out these medals called Freedom Medals every year to 2 or 3 Scientologists that Miscavige has decided to recognize as, they've gone above and beyond the Call of Duty, whatever. Well, for Tom that year, they made a special large medal, much bigger, and called it the Freedom Medal of Valor, and gave it to him in a 35-minute ceremony. I've posted it all online before, including a 9-minute segment of Tom giving an interview in a black turtleneck. This was in October 2004. So Tom was, he was gung-ho, he was revved up. David Miscavige was talking about him like he's the most enthusiastic Scientologist in the world. And that's when they sent him out to kind of be an ambassador early in 2005. And it was a disaster. I mean, he was head over heels in love with Katie Holmes at the time. He was jumping on Oprah's couch. He had that notorious interview with Matt Lauer. It just totally backfired on him. Tom Cruise out in the public talking about Scientology sounded like a lunatic. And so they realized it was a big mistake. They pulled him back. He has said almost nothing in the 11 years since. And people have wondered, well, is he still dedicated or not? And for some reason, there is this set of tabloid publications that are just determined to convince people that Tom Cruise has left Scientology or is leaving. And they never have any evidence whatsoever. And I keep finding evidence of Tom attending these events and going to new Scientology churches, proof that he's still as dedicated as ever. He just doesn't go out and give interviews about it. So I don't know why these tabloids want to try to promote this false story, because everything I've seen tells me that Tom is still very much dedicated. He's not a public ambassador because right now they have virtually nobody. They don't even have a public spokesman to go on camera and talk about Scientology right now. It's a very Scientology is very much in a sort of bunker mentality. It's shrinking. It's been really looked at with a lot of harsh documentaries and newspaper exposés. And so the fact that their stars say almost nothing is part of that. But then you asked about the levels. So, like I said, when you first get into Scientology, they just tell you stuff about how you're going to improve your communications. It's very vague. And you immediately start working on ways to, they're called training routines, how to hold a stare for a long time without blinking, how to be, to not flinch as people are yelling at you. They're really kind of breaking down the ego and making you pliable. And then you learn a whole new way of learning, which is just basically looking words up in the dictionary and making models in clay. And it's a very low level of indoctrination, and then starts getting stranger and stranger as you're asked to go through this auditing and remember your past lives. And it gets more and more expensive. Eventually, you're supposed to go clear. This is the big intermediate goal, and this takes a couple, a year or two usually, at least. And once you're clear, then you moved on to something called the operating Thetan levels, OT levels. These are very expensive. These are anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 per level. OT 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 is the top one. OT 3 is famous because that's when you learn from L. Ron Hubbard in his own handwriting this backstory that Xenu, the galactic overlord, had solved his overpopulation problem by bringing billions of creatures to the planet Tegiak, which today we call Earth, 75 million years ago, blew up all these creatures in volcanoes, captured their souls electronically. Thetans, they're called in Scientology, they're Thetans, and reprogrammed them by having them watch 3D movies for 36 days and then set them loose on the Earth. And to this day, each of us has hundreds or thousands of these invisible alien souls, body Thetans, attached to us. And so from OT3 and above, the purpose of Scientology is to remove these unseen entities. And so That's what Tom Cruise is doing. That's what Kirstie Alley is doing. At hundreds of dollars an hour, they are going through these processes that they believe chase off these invisible souls that are attached to them called body things. That's at OT3. When you get to OT7, OT7 is notorious because it takes so long. For whatever reason, chasing off your body thetans at OT7 takes much longer than any other level. It can take years, and and you're supposed to do it at home on your own, by the way, which is incredible to me that you would pay thousands and thousands of dollars for something that you then do at home with nobody even checking. But then every 6 months, you have to come into the Flag Land Base in Florida to get an interrogation, and that costs thousands of dollars. Tom Cruise has been stuck on that level, or I think he's finished it actually. He finally did finish that years ago, but I don't know that he's ever gone on to OT8. OT8, the last level, at least currently, they're talking about releasing OT9 and 10. OT8 is only delivered on the cruise ship, the Freewinds, which sails in the Caribbean. And like I said, as far as I know, Tom Cruise has not done that level, but I think Kirstie Alley has. She finally did it. I'm not sure where Travolta is. But these are, I mean, we're talking $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 per level for this stuff. Chick Corea just finished OT8 for the second time. I don't know how that works. And he said it's in today's story on my website. I'll give you the quote where he's talking about what it was that this ultimate level of Scientology gave him. He said it helped him achieve an independent attitude in relation to existence. Now, Mark Headley has calculated that between all the levels and what each of them costs, plus all the donations you're asked to give along the way, and all the money you spend on accommodations, that to go from the very beginning all the way to OT8 will cost you anywhere between $500,000 and $2 million. And again, this is what Chick Corea got out of that: to achieve an independent attitude in relation to existence. I don't know. I don't.
That's some expensive hypnosis right there.
I mean, it's basically, what does that translate to? You get a little confidence. And in fact, I think Marty Rathbun has actually talked about that in his book, that ultimately what they're selling is confidence. And I'm just thinking, man, that's a high price for confidence. It's a confidence trick is what it is. So anyway, that's what these celebrities are all doing. They don't want to talk about it. If you ask them directly, they'll say, oh, it helped me in my life. You should get a book and read about it. That's all they'll say. They won't talk about auditing. They won't talk about past lives. They won't talk about body thetans. But we know all these things because many more Scientologists have left Scientology than are currently in it. And they all tell the same exact story. They bring the paperwork out with them. We have the paperwork and court records. We know what Scientology is. There really are no secrets about these levels and what they're selling. So, but they know that the only way they can get new people in is to try to keep it a secret. And that's another reason why they're hurting so much today, is that the internet makes it so much more difficult to keep things secret. I still meet young people who joined Scientology, and they basically admit that they knew nothing about it when they went in, which is incredible, because if you just type the word Scientology into Google, you can't believe how much stuff there is about it. But there are still people that I guess are looking for something and don't do their homework.
Well, and I think also a lot of times, even if people do know about it when they go into it, it's almost like something exciting to them. They're doing something different. They're exploring new territory. And I'm wondering also, I mean, this sounds to me like they're using some very good psychological tactics. They're using some good hypnosis. And I think that if somebody gets hypnotized by a good hypnotherapist, it can have incredible results. And I don't think they charge $50,000 a session, though. That's a big money right there. And I could see also how this could be for entertainers, obviously, for people that have just tons of money, get in with that cliche. And just like every other product that's marketed in the mainstream media, get some public figures that are popular and, entertainers, and there you go. Voila, that's the formula to success. But I do appreciate how you're bringing up the different levels and how things are a lot more difficult to hide now. Could you talk to us about this auditing process? This sounds incredible.
Well, I mean, that's the central part of it, and that's been around since the beginning. Hubbard was a hypnotist. I mean, we have letters from people that knew him in the 40s that say he was a master hypnotist. He would put on an incredible stage show, and he would have people doing just hilarious things. Those kind of hypnotist shows that people put on. And it's very clear that Scientology auditing uses hypnotics. But if you say that to a Scientologist, they will violently disagree with you and claim there's no hypnosis in Scientology. But it's just not true. I mean, they definitely want to put you in a trance. One of the ways they do it is Scientology is all about repetition. Just you can't imagine the repetition. I'll give you one example of an auditing session. Um, a big thing that opened a couple years ago, something called the Superpower Building. This was something that they first broke ground on in the early 90s, and they were building for 20 years. It's a city block size building in Clearwater, Florida. Probably cost them $80 million to build it, but they raised like 200 because that's how they do things. And this was going to deliver superpower. There's a whole history to what L. Ron Hubbard actually intended for it, but basically there's no question that to the Scientologists today, to the wealthy Scientologists, as long on your way up the bridge to OT8, you also want to do superpower because it's this, doesn't it sound great? Superpower. And well,
sounds like fun to me.
Yeah, what is superpower? Well, the people who have left Scientology actually, have those documents, and they shared them with me. Superpower consists of several different what they call rundowns, and I had one of the former technical experts, really top technical guy, help me understand just one of them, just one of the rundowns that you're going to be paying tens of thousands of dollars for. It's called the Bright Think rundown. So you're in an auditing session with an auditor, and the word auditor just means someone who listens. So the auditor is the person who's going to ask you questions about yourself, and then you're going to answer them. And then watch how the needle on the meter reacts. And I will tell you that an e-meter is simply a skid galvanometer that's measuring tiny differences in voltage, and it can be affected by your grip or all kinds of things. But Scientologists believe that it's actually kind of reading your mind. And so if the needle moves, it's not because you suddenly squeezed it harder, it's because you've had some thought that it discovered. And so they really believe they're probing their mind for things that they aren't even aware of. And so the auditor's job is to ask questions, look at how the needle reacts, and say, oh, there's something there that you need to explore more. Then they'll ask you to dive into that area. So in the Bright Think rundown, part of superpower, the auditor asks you a question. Where do you feel safe? You got to understand, Rex, I'm letting you in on something they pay $10,000 for here, okay? So that I'm saving you 10 grand.
Thanks.
All right. So the auditor says, where do you feel safe? And then it's your job to, think about it and come up with an answer. Okay. The auditor then says, where do you feel safe? And you have to come up with a different answer. And then the auditor says, where do you feel safe? And they ask it over and over and over. And that's it. That's all there is to this entire process. And I remember I was so stunned, and the guy that had told me about this and had given me the document on it, showing in L. Ron Hubbard's own writing that this is what it is, he could tell I was flabbergasted. And he said, well, listen, Tony, you have to understand, after you've answered that question 300 or 400 times, you'll be amazed at what kind of answers you come up with. Well, what he's talking about is hypnotism. You go into a trance when you know what I'm saying, when you're just told to ask and you're asked and asked and asked and asked. You can't move and you're just sitting there. So that's all Scientology is, man. And we've got those lists of questions for all. If you go to my website, TonyOrtega.org, the Underground Bunker, at the top we've got a list of buttons, and one of them says Up the Bridge. One of the technical experts in Scientology, Claire Headley, and I went through every single level from the very beginning all the way to the OTs. And we went through what's in those levels and what do they contain. And in many of those, we actually have the lists of questions that you're paying thousands of dollars to have asked to you. And most of the time, they're no more sophisticated than that. Where do you feel safe? Or, when have you given something to someone? When has someone given something to you? And then once you remember something, give me something earlier similar. So you not only remember when somebody gave you something last week, but you're talking about when somebody gave you something 4 million years ago on the planet, whatever. That's Scientology, and that's all it is. I remember when I was telling Mark Headley that I was, former Scientologist, that I was kind of stunned by all this. He said, that's what I could never get people to understand. Scientology is really simple. It's just about repetition. And that's what these people are paying so much money for. They really believe that L. Ron Hubbard, this 1930s pulp fiction, science fiction writer, somehow came up with just the right set of questions to unleash the secrets of the universe. That's their version. My version is he's a very talented, marketer who convinced these people that they're somehow unlocking the paths of the galaxy with these silly little questions. So, but that's my opinion.
Well, and also, don't they use certain tactics that our own military and certain alphabet agencies use and stuff like that to know somebody's psychological profile so they can either use it against them or orchestrate them in certain ways, essentially?
Well, it's a lot more simple than that. They interrogate you. So okay, so here's the e-meter I was talking about, and it's just measuring your skin galvanism. They put a little current through your body, which you can't even feel. And like I said, because if they attach the sensors to your head and we're just trying to measure brain waves, that might be one thing. But they put the sensors in your hands, which makes no sense because then you can't hold them perfectly still. It's like a Ouija. That's how the Ouija board works, right?
Right.
The Ouija board works because you can't tell that you're pushing the thing because you can't. As much as you think you cannot control the muscles in your hands with complete control. And so when you're holding the sensors, they're just like tin cans. You cannot hold them completely perfectly still. And if you have slight little variations in your grip, it's measured in the needle. But they're convinced it's measuring something in your head. Anyway, we could argue about this forever. But the point is, I think, and I'm backed up by electrical engineers to tell you this is a very crude device that doesn't measure anything. But that doesn't matter. All that matters is that the Scientologist is convinced that he cannot hold back information without that needle moving. And once you believe that, Rex, man, you will spill your guts, right? Because you believe that machine knows all, and they do. So when they're not auditing, when you're not, going through this sort of a counseling, they're asking you questions, you're talking about your past life. They then do something called a security check, where you get on the cans, you're on the e-meter, and now they're not just asking you questions because it might help you feel better. Now they're asking you questions because they want the information. What was your first sexual experience? Who was the last person you slept with? When was the last time you masturbated? I mean, they're really obsessed with sex. They're very obsessed with masturbation. You will have to go in and do one of these security checks fairly often, and they cost, and you have to pay for it. And we've been hearing about upper-level Scientologists that have to go in occasionally and spend several $1,000s talking about their masturbation habits. It's just bizarre. But when they want to know everything about you. They want to know everything about the people around you. And of course, what are they doing? They're writing it all down. They're building a file on you. So, you asked me if this is something that a sophisticated thing the military does. No, I mean, this is just basic information gathering, and they've got this file on you. And they use it. I mean, if they find out from you that somebody is sleeping with their, sleeping around over here, then they'll go interrogate them. It's a great money-making venture for them because then they can pressure people to go through their own interrogations and use that information to leverage people to donate more money. Scientology is a snitching culture. It's an interrogation culture. And it's one that really operates on fear.
And it sounds like it's like that old school communist type tactics that they're using almost. The Communist Manifesto handbook, if anybody's ever read that, there's some similarities there. This is incredible stuff.
Any kind of high control totalitarian organization, they all use the same methods. I mean, I remember I was looking into a Catholic group that's very unusual that has a reputation for this kind of thing. And I was stunned to see how many of their methods are exactly the same as what's done in Scientology. So it really has nothing to do with the beliefs. It's really how do you keep people under control? And all of these groups, whether it's the dictator of North Korea or the leader of a Catholic sect or Scientology, they all use the same methods to control people, and it's primarily through fear.
Do you feel that many religions kind of use the same underlying theme, except for obviously the auditing and stuff like that, but just as far as fear-based tactics and psychological conditioning?
Well, the next question then gets into is Scientology a cult and what's the difference between a religion and a cult? I tend not to argue about that. I think that's something the academics can spend their hours on if they want to. I think all religions have beliefs that in the light of day look silly or unusual. And yeah, you could say Scientology is no different than that with their body thetans and their Xenu and all that kind of thing. I understand that point of view, but Scientology, the way they use extortion and leveraging family members against each other and have children snitching on parents and then the incredible prices, Scientology is really in a league of its own. And I don't think it's fair to say, well, the Roman Catholic Church has a lot of guilt in it. I mean, it's just not the same ballpark. I'm not somebody who's religious, so I'm not. I just think that Scientology has so many unique elements to it that make it, like I said, it shares a lot of these tactics with other high control groups. But there's something about Scientology that it's got these totalitarian tendencies. It's got this really strict snitching culture. You're supposed to turn in your own parents if you catch them reading negative things about Scientology. And it's got this secrecy where even the Scientologists themselves are kept in the dark about most of what's going on in the organization. And then on top of that, you got these celebrities. I mean, it's such an odd combination of things, which is why I think it's still such a popular subject with the public. And publications know that if they write anything about Scientology, it's going to be the most read thing in their paper that day. People are fascinated, and there's no question why. I mean, it's the secrecy, it's the celebrities, it's the odd beliefs. Even though I will grant you, other religions also have odd beliefs.
Well, certainly. And one thing that I do find fascinating, whatever somebody's religious preference is, whether they're Christian, Muslim, agnostic, maybe they're into the occult, if they're good people and if that gets them to where they need to be, hey, right on. I'm not going to judge.
Well, and if this was just a matter of some people that had some odd beliefs about the solar system, I wouldn't care. It's the way that they use the bait and switch that you don't even learn about Xenu until you've been in for 6 or 7 years and you've spent a couple $100,000. Things like that, and they're bullies. I mean, they really, if you leave Scientology and say anything about it, they will go after you, and they go after journalists, and they have for 50 years, and they use really disgusting tactics. So for all of those reasons, Scientology really does distinguish itself and is worth watching.
Now, also on your website, TonyOrtega.org, you have access to just a bounty of information. I know you recently you were on HBO. You put together a book called Going Clear, Scientology is Prison Belief. Then you've also written the
book Going Clear, Hollywood, Scientology, and the Scientology, Hollywood, and the Prison of Belief is by Lawrence Wright. And Lawrence was also behind the movie with Alice Gibney. My book is called The Unbreakable Miss Lovely, and it's about Larry's book, Going Clear, was about the whole history of Scientology. My book was more specific. I wrote about a particular woman named Paulette Cooper, who was one of the first journalists ever to expose Scientology with her book in 1971 called The Scandal of Scientology. And like I was just saying, they go after critics, and they went after her like they've never gone after anybody, and they got her indicted for a crime she didn't commit. She was facing 15 years in prison. At one point, she came close to killing herself. I mean, they threw multiple operations at her over many years, and my book is the first to really tell that whole story. I told it with her cooperation, but I also found original documents. I interviewed people that were actually part of those operations against her, and I tried to tell it in a way where it's unfolding as you read it. It's not like a dry academic paper. It reads like a novel, and the audiobook version is just out from Audible. The Unbreakable Miss Lovely, and people seem to really enjoy the way it was told. And Paulette's just a fascinating character. She survived all that. She's doing great. She lives in Florida today. She turned 74 this year, and she looks wonderful. And the name Miss Lovely was Scientology's code word for her. If you look in the documents of their spies, Scientology has a spy wing. It's the only church I know that has a spy wing. In their documents of their spy wing, they would refer to her as Miss Lovely. So that's where I get the title, The Unbreakable Miss Lovely.
Well, I'm looking at the cover right now on your website, and if that's her on the front page, obviously on the cover, yeah, she's beautiful. Now, also, you bring up the spies within Scientology, the auditing, these weird machines that they hook themselves up to, the amount of money that they have to pay to get to the next level. And it sounds to me like it's more of a rich person's club. Let's join the niche. Well, that person over there is in Hollywood and he's at a level 7, so I've got the money. I could be at a level 8, and it's like a competition thing almost. So
it's like a role playing game. It's definitely somebody, in the language that we use today, L. Ron Hubbard gamified religion. And there's a saying in Scientology, because you don't see poor people in Scientology. You see very few minorities. And you don't see like handicapped people. You don't see people in a wheelchair in Scientology. Because literally one of the slogans of Scientology is, we make the able more able. They don't want you if you don't have money. They tend to prey on the children of middle to upper middle class parents who are dissatisfied with their lives. And one of the things Scientology offers is certainty. You're not sure what to do with your life. You're having setbacks. Fill out this check sheet. Take this course. We'll give you a great life. And, I think most of us know that it doesn't work that way. And that's why Scientology's never been popular. It's only a small minority of people that ever got involved in Scientology. Because I think most of us understand that it just doesn't you can't just fill out a form and your life is great. I mean, there's all of us are going to experience setbacks. All of us are going to have our ups and downs, and it's just a matter of persevering. But Scientology really offers this idea of certainty. No matter what your problem is, we've got the answer for it. And then once you get into it, and you agree to their indoctrination that everything good in your life comes from Scientology, and everything bad in your life is because you didn't apply Scientology correctly, that's when the fear comes in, because you can't get off that train. You can't, you've been telling them everything in your life under indoctrination, under interrogation, and they've been writing it all down. And if you leave and speak out, they've got this file on you with all of your deepest secrets. Hey Rex, let me turn on the light. It's getting dark down here.
Absolutely.
Just hang on just a second.
Yeah, I was talking to Paul Beagle yesterday, and during the interview, it actually got dark as well at his place because
let's splice that in.
Yeah. So hey, I mean, we're definitely hitting on some great things here. What do you feel is pertinent and important in this presentation that people should be aware of that maybe isn't as accessible via the internet?
Well, I think you can learn a lot about Scientology from the internet, but what you're not maybe going to experience that you do firsthand is the people and what they've gone through and how difficult things have been for them. And one of the things I've tried to do in my coverage is really bring the stories of people who have been harmed and have come out and don't really have a voice otherwise to explain what they've been through. But when you meet these people, I mean, they're wonderful people. They joined for all the right reasons. They thought they were going to improve their lives. They thought they were going to improve the lives of other people. And then later on, they realized, they were part of this totalitarian group that had complete control over them, and they just leaving was terrifying. Most people who leave Scientology never speak up about it. I mean, for every Mark Headley or Claire Headley or Leah Remini or Paul Haggis that you've heard of, there are many, many, many more people that have left Scientology and are just really fearful of saying anything. And a number of those people contact me privately. I hear from people all the time who want to tell me their story, but they can't say it publicly, but they want to get some advice and that kind of thing. And so that's the kind of thing you're not going to get on the internet, is some of the personal experience that I've gotten with these people and just how terrified they are. And because when you leave, what happens is, if you do speak up, if you leave and make it known, that becomes a problem, and the church then tries to punish you. And if you don't fall into line, they will then declare you a suppressive person. That's the language they use. It's basically an excommunication. And once you've been declared an SP, everyone else, the Church of Scientology, if they want to remain in good standing, has to cut off all contact with you, even if that means it's the people in your own family. So this happens all the time. Scientology families get split apart, and then also the other thing that happens is a lot of time the person who's been declared SP, they might have a business where half or more of their clients are Scientologists. Well, if you've been declared SP, you lose all those clients overnight. And so that's what these people have to think about is, do I say anything? If I say anything, it could wreck my career. My family could come apart. And I've put a lot of examples of those kind of situations on my website. And Scientologists go through that every day, trying to decide, what can I say? What can I do? And it's just really terrorizing them. So that's the thing that I think I wish people could meet some of these folks and talk to them, and they'd really get a sense of how serious this is.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just a couple more questions. The tactics that they used on Miss Lovely, you said that she almost got indicted for a crime that she didn't commit. Could you get into that a little bit with us?
She was indicted. What they did was she investigated the church. She wrote a story for a magazine, and then she turned that into a book. Very well researched. Still holds up 40 years later. And right from the beginning, from the day the magazine article came out, she started getting death threats on the phone. Some of the tactics are so disgusting. Like one day she came home and there was a letter that had been distributed to all the people in her building, calling her a prostitute and saying that she had venereal disease and all this stuff that wasn't true. It was really disgusting. And of course, nobody knew where the letter came from, and her letters like that would be sent to her parents, her friends. It's one of the key tactics of Scientology is that if they want to harm a critic, they aim at all their loved ones. And you get these anonymous phone calls, anonymous websites that go after people, and it's always to creep you out. The point is to make you feel so under attack that you just, okay, I don't want to have anything to do with you, Scientology. But Paulette didn't let up. She was still going on TV talking about Scientology. She was still helping other journalists, and it drove them crazy. So we have their planning documents where you can actually see the spies talking about what to do about this woman. And so they cooked up this scheme where they managed to get her fingerprint on a piece of paper, and then they typed up a bomb threat to themselves on it and mailed it to themselves. And then when they got it, they called the FBI and said, "Hey, look, somebody's threatening to blow up our building. We think it's this Paulette Cooper woman." And the FBI looked at that, and it was, it didn't sound like Paulette Cooper, but it had her fingerprint on it. So they submitted it for prosecution, and the prosecutor indicted her in May 1973, and she was facing, and there were 2 letters, and then she had told the grand jury that she didn't do it. So they indicted her on 3 counts, one for each letter, plus lying to the grand jury, they said. So she was facing 15 years in federal prison, and a trial was scheduled for October 73. And over that whole summer of 73, she was just completely sick with worry over it. She came very close to killing herself. And she felt that her attorneys didn't really believe her. I'm the first journalist that actually talked to those attorneys and discussed with them how they ultimately got her out of that case. It's a fascinating story about how they derailed that prosecution. She wasn't really exonerated, though, until 1977, when the FBI raided the Church of Scientology, because the other spies, the spies that had been trying to wreck Paulette's life, but other spies as well, were breaking into federal government offices from 74 to 77, stealing documents, and they were caught. And one of the spies turned evidence. And so in July 1977, the FBI raided the Church of Scientology in the largest raid in the history of the FBI to that point. And while they were taking out these tens of thousands of documents from the Church of Scientology, they found these documents spelling out all the operations they were running against Paulette Cooper. And some of them are so elaborate. I described them in the book. I mean, you can't believe the lengths they went to try to portray her as crazy, to make her question her own decisions. Very subtle techniques. I mean, this was a very sophisticated intelligence operation that Scientology was running. And those documents helped exonerate her finally, her story finally first came out in, I think, October 78. But she had been undergoing harassment since late 69. So it's 9 years. She had been putting up with harassment, phone calls, this indictment. I mean, nobody's gone through as much as she had. And then they started up a whole new operation in 1980 that most people, I think, had forgotten about until I wrote my book. She finally settled, and also they were suing her. I mean, she at one point they had 19 lawsuits going against her, and they were finally all settled. The last of them was in 1985. But I discovered that they had a spy checking on her as recently as 2010.
Jeez. It sounds to me like she was a huge thorn in their side. And do they attack you? I mean, do they come after your integrity?
Yeah, they not as bad as Paulette, but they have gone after me and used some of the similar tactics, as a matter of fact. And but what happened was, so the spy wing that was doing these things to her was called the Guardian's Office, and it was very clear the Guardian's Office was using all kinds of illegal tactics. They tapped her phones. They were breaking into federal government offices, and then, like I said, they finally got caught and were prosecuted. And 11 top Scientologists went to prison in the early 1980s over after the raid, not over the stuff they did to Paulette, but the government office stuff. And so at that point, the Guardian's Office was disbanded, and it was replaced with something called the Office of Special Affairs. And so if you ask the Church of Scientology today about, hey, didn't you guys break the Snow White? It was called the Snow White Project, and Snow White Program, and it was the biggest infiltration of the U.S. federal government in history. And if you ask them about it, they will say, oh, well, the Guardian's Office was a rogue unit. We got rid of it. But it's just not true. I mean, it was very clear that L. Ron Hubbard had dreamed up this whole scheme. His wife was running it. And once they got caught, they disbanded the Guardian's Office. They basically jettisoned Mary Sue. Hubbard went into hiding, and they replaced it with something called the Office of Special Affairs. Now, the people who ran the Office of Special Affairs have come out, and they will say, listen, we really did clean things up. And use Mike Rinder in particular will tell you that. He used to run OSA, and he said, we don't do illegal things anymore. Well, let me tell you, my book about Paulette and the illegal things Scientology was doing to her came out in May of last year. 10 days after my book came out, I was contacted by the U.S. Attorney's Office. They wanted to let me know that a private investigator was going to be sentenced to prison, and I was one of his victims, and did I want to come into court and say anything? And I said, what? Well, I remember confronting this guy because I'd caught him spoofing me. You know what spoofing is? He'd been sending out emails under my name, and apparently he had been trying to get access to my stuff, but he never. I have no evidence that he ever got access to my information, but he was trying. And I had forgotten about him, but apparently they caught him, breaking into other people's email, and we're going to send him to prison. And I immediately thought, oh, this guy must have been working for the Church of Scientology, but his attorney wouldn't admit it. Well, then, just the day before he was going to be sentenced, I was comparing notes with Mike Rinder, and he said, wait a minute, they asked me to do that too. I'm one of his victims. And then we realized, oh, come on. There's only one client in the world that would pay a private investigator to try to hack into the emails of Tony Ortega and Mike Rinder. And sure enough, the New York Times did report that it was the Church of Scientology that this guy was working for when he tried to hack our emails, and he went to prison for it. So it was like a gift from the Church of Scientology proving that, as my book was coming out, not only were they doing illegal things to Paulette Cooper back in the 70s, but they're still doing illegal things to the guy that wrote the book about Paulette Cooper today. So that private investigator went to federal prison just for a few months. But it was really it's a shame that the FBI couldn't pursue that. Apparently they were trying to get more information about the church about it, but it didn't really go anywhere. But it just shows you that even though they've given it a new name, they're still doing the same old thing. They're still trying to, basically, if they believe that you are an enemy, whether you're a former Scientologist or a journalist, they don't want to just prove that you're wrong. They don't want to just say, hey, Tony Ortega's article was unfair. Here's the real facts. No, they want to destroy your life. They go after your loved ones. They try to get you, you lose your job. I mean, it's just all these things they do to people all the time. And it's just the reason why they do it is L. Ron Hubbard spelled this out in documents back in the 50s and 60s. And he's dead, and they can't change his words, but they consider him almost a god, and so they can't change anything he wrote. So they do the same things over and over and over again.
We certainly live in amazing times with everything that's going on, and it's great to speak with you, Tony. I certainly wish you the very best. Stay safe. I would strongly recommend our audience, if you'd like to know more in detail about Scientology, check out the Underground Bunker at TonyOrtega.org. Pick up your copy of The Unbreakable Miss Lovely, also available in audio format. And thank you so much, Tony. I appreciate you spending time with us.
Hey, man, thanks for having me on. This has been fun.
Absolutely. This has been great. Also, I'd recommend our audience go to youtube.com/clandestine time lord and leakproject.com. Be the change you want to see, folks. Have a fantastic day. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I am your host, Rex Bear, and we have Tony Ortega with us from TonyOrtega.org, the Underground Bunker. And we are going to dive deep into Scientology today. He's been doing research for years on this. He is the go-to source. He's been featured on HBO, Discovery Channel. I spoke with him a couple years ago, and just a plethora of intel. It's a real honor to speak with you, Tony, here at the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
Hey, thanks for having me on. Things are great.
Fantastic. Well, a lot of our listeners have actually requested I get you on the show, and I'm a huge fan of science fiction. I absolutely love it, and it certainly seems like science fiction has kind of taken over certain religious aspects now. I have a very close friend that's into Scientology, and it seems like she even knows what it's about, but she's trying to get involved, and it's very interesting. So if you would, for our audience, please tell them a little bit about yourself, and then let's jump into the meat and potatoes.
Sure. Well, I'm a journalist. I worked for various newspapers over the years, and starting back in 1995, I just developed a sort of interest and specialty in Scientology. I covered a lot of other subjects over the years, but I would always come back to Scientology. I'd developed some really good sources in it, and the reason why I've continued to cover it is it's just a fascinating, changing story. Scientology's only been around for 60 years, but the last few have really been a really crucial time. It's going through a very difficult time. It's splitting apart. It's changing, and for those reasons, I've stayed interested. And I decided a couple years back to actually write a book about one aspect of it, and created a website to support that book and to cover Scientology as a daily beat. So that's what I've been doing. And yeah, as you mentioned, it's gotten me on several programs. I was on Alex Gibney's documentary Going Clear that was on HBO last year. And, it's just been fascinating to watch how this stuff changes. As far as what Scientology is all about, it's interesting to hear you say that you've got a friend that's getting into it. Oftentimes, I have people that were in Scientology for many years come to my website and tell me they only really learned about what Scientology is all about once they left. That, Scientology is one of these things that when you get into it, they only want you to learn a little bit at a time. And what those of us who study the whole project get to know is material that people don't discover inside until they've been in it for years and years. And sometimes they never discover it until they come out and they read my website, talk to people at my website. And so that's one of the reasons why, one of the many reasons why Scientology is such a fascinating subject is that it's secretive even to its own people. And, many of the beginners never find out anything about what's in the operating Thetan levels, what entities like the Religious Technology Center and the Church of Spiritual Technology are doing, and why Scientology has underground vaults in parts of the country, and so many fascinating, strange, and like you said, sort of related to science fiction elements in Scientology that I really enjoy studying. But like I said, Scientologists themselves often don't know about until they leave.
Now, that kind of reminds me of certain mystery schools. Once you get initiated to a different level, then they give you more information, etc. And right. If I obviously know it was Hubbard that founded the Church of Scientology. I know a little bit about his background, hanging out with people like Parsons and Crowley. And he was a brilliant man, very, very intelligent. So didn't he used to talk about ways to make money would be start a religion, though? Wasn't that something he used to brag about before?
This is one of those things that comes up all the time. And I actually dug into it because there's a few different sort of stories going around about L. Ron Hubbard and how he started all this. Hubbard really led a very remarkable life. He was born in Nebraska, but he grew up in the Pacific Northwest. His dad was in the Navy, so he ended up in places like, China and the Philippines when he was just a kid. He really saw a lot of the world and was fascinated by it. He was a glider pilot when he was only in his 20s. He tried multiple times to get into the military and finally got into the Navy as a lieutenant during World War II. And, he developed the skills of a tall tale teller, which served him well because in the 30s and the 40s, he became a very successful pulp fiction writer. He wrote, stories about Westerns and adventures and romances. And science fiction was just one of the things he got known for. It's the thing he was probably most well known for was science fiction. And, he was just a really prolific writer, wrote all kinds of short stories for magazines back in the day. But it was, it was hard work and it didn't pay well. He was making about a penny a word. And so in he went to war, came back. He did not have a very distinguished war record. He actually had some embarrassing incidents. And he was looking for a new direction in his life. And he started working on this project around 1948. And around that time, in 1948 and 49, he started telling people, he told multiple people this in multiple times, that, writing at a penny a word just isn't going to get you anywhere. And if you really wanted to make a fortune, you need to start a religion. And we know that he said this because we have eyewitnesses. The FDA investigated him and found those eyewitnesses. It's all documented. Scientology tries to pretend it never happened, but there's no question. In 48 and 49, L. Ron Hubbard told multiple people that the way to get rich was to start a religion. Now, there's another story about the start of Scientology that I remember hearing 20 years ago, and that was that Hubbard and his he had very good friends in the science fiction community, one of whom was Robert Heinlein, who was probably his best friend in science fiction. And there's a story that the two of them made a bet to see who could start the most profitable religion. I think that's an apocryphal story, especially since I've actually read the letters between Hubbard and Heinlein in this period, and there's nothing like that in them. So I don't think that story's true, but it's definitely true that Hubbard was telling people that, if you want to make a lot of money, you need to start a religion. He then came out with a book in 1950 that wasn't religious at all. It's called Dianetics, and the subtitle is The Modern Science of Mental Health. And it's very important to keep that in mind. He advertised this from the beginning as a new science. He believed that he was the first person to discover how the human mind actually worked, that it had two halves. One half was this perfectly recording analytical mind that is this perfect computer. But when you were knocked unconscious and you went through traumatic incidents, this other half of your mind took over. It's called the reactive mind. And he theorized that this was a result of evolution, and that when you were going through really awful experiences, this other part of the mind took over to spare you the worst of it. But it recorded those incidents, and then those incidents would come back up when you were re-stimulated. And he theorized that everything that was holding you back in your adult life was the result of these awful memories you went through as a very young child, and they're literally stored in your cells. He abandoned that theory pretty quickly, but that was the original idea. And the most powerful of those theories, of those traumatic memories, which he called engrams, occurred when you were in the womb. That when you were a fetus, or even a sperm cell or an egg cell, things that happened to you were stored in your cells, and as an adult, something would trigger it, and you'd have this memory. And so when Dianetics first came out, he had these clubs sprout out all around the country where people wanted to try to remember what awful things they had gone through when they were fetuses inside their mother. And I got to tell you, there's absolutely no science to this. It's completely ludicrous. You do not have memories of being a fetus stored in your cells. But it was popular for about a year, and he made a lot of money, and it changed his life. And then it just completely died out. His foundations he founded went bankrupt. He had to start all over again. And by that time, a lot of the people that liked this idea of going back in time to find out what's wrong with you today felt that going back to the womb wasn't far enough. They wanted to go back even farther to previous lives. And Hubbard was a little skeptical about this at first, but then he realized, if you can charge people to try to remember what happened in one lifetime,